structural geometry, system stability of Humans-Geopolitics, and an AI distinction, number 1610, April 24, 2026, Gerald C. EclaireMD Foundation, category, Biomedical System Dynamics. IA Systems, Systems Modeling. Preface. This article consolidates a sequence of my analytical reflection notes from my medical research work into a unified framework, strictly speaking. It does not yet meet my quality standard for a research paper since it lacks quantitative analysis. Proof, however, its thoughts are worthwhile to preserve. The original discussion focused on the comparison between the human biomedical system and the geopolitical system. A second comparison then emerged between natural intelligence and artificial intelligence. IA, a concrete example geometric reconstruction from the same strain stress, or outout-input. Dataset provides direct evidence that these two comparisons are structurally related. The objective of this paper is to integrate these observations into a coherent, mechanism-based interpretation of system behavior, learning structure, and stability. Geometry reconstruction from identical data, from a single strain stress output-input dataset. Two different geometric graphics with interpretations were produced by the human brain and artificial intelligence tools AI. The knee-based reconstruction forms a closed-loop trajectory with high accuracy. But 3 commercial AI tools generated reconstructions that produce separate monotonic curves which were inaccurate. This difference is not a matter of visualization preference. It reflects a structural distinction in how information embedded in the data is interpreted and preserved. AI has no eye and depends only on numerical data to measure distance and generate curves. It performs mathematical fitting based on smoothness or pattern similarity, rather than recognizing structural relationships within the dataset during the rendering process. The generated curves may appear smooth and reasonable, but they do not preserve the physical mean embedded in the data. As a result, the geometry becomes visually acceptable but physically incorrect, and the original correlation and path dependency within the dataset are lost. The knee-generated loop maintains nonlinear curvature, captures the turning region of the strain-stress relationship, and preserves the interaction among variables. The geometry remains consistent with VMT energy distribution and aligns with TH numerical relationships contained in the original data table. The commercial AI-generated curves, although smooth and better looking, separate the trajectory into monotonic segments. The loop structure disappears. Path dependency is not represented correctly, and interaction relationships are weakened. The resulting geometry no longer corresponds to the numerical structure of the data. Simply speaking, AI-generated graphics are wrong. Besides, when AI makes mistakes, even if I give instructions to correct them, it is often incapable of making the correction. This repetition sometimes takes more than a dozen times, or even up to 15 times. If I use dumb computer software, like Excel or a graphic generator on a PC, they follow my instructions exactly. Of course, I must give the instructions step by step and manually control the process. But Excel produces 100% accurate graphics. AI just generates wrong graphics no matter how hard I try. This is my experience thus far when dealing with structure-dependent, path-dependent data. Structural basis of loop formation. The loop structure can be identified directly from the data without graphical construction, but only if the reader clearly understands what the data is doing. One example, the output strain sequence, 63 gives 19 gives 96. Means the system first drops significantly, then rises sharply. At the same time, the stress components do not move in a single direction, some reverse direction, and their relative magnitudes change during this process. Near the end period 2024 to 2026, the changes become small, indicating the system is settling down. This is not a simple upward downtrend. The system first moves in one direction, then turns and moves back in another direction. When you connect this path, it naturally forms a loop. This observation is quite common in biomedical data patterns. The loop exists because different stress components respond differently to the same strain rate change. Some increase while others decrease, and they do so at different speeds. This mismatch creates a turning behavior in the biomedical path. In simple terms, the system does not go from point A to point B in a straight line. It goes forward, turns, and comes back along a different path. That is why the loading path and unloading path are not the same. This is what we call a path-dependent system. The current state depends not only on the current value, but also on how the system arrived there. This type of behavior is common in systems with memory and cumulative effects, such as dynamic plastic engineering materials and human organs or tissues, and in some cellular processes. Without showing the data and graph with clearly describing the direction changes, readers will not know what we are talking about. Engineering interpretation and energy meaning. Loop structures of this type are well established in engineering mechanics. They appear in cyclic loading stress-strain curves, fatigue hysteresis loops, and viscoelastic deformation paths. In these systems, the enclosed area of the loop represents energy dissipation. The geometry is therefore not a visual artifact, it encodes physical meaning. The same interpretation applies here. The loop represents VMT energy accumulated through system evolution. Removing the loop removes information about energy distribution and system behavior. For an observer trained in physics or engineering, the mapping becomes direct. Data table gives geometric trajectory, gives system mechanism. Geometry is inferred from structure, not constructed for presentation. Geometry as scientific information. This example supports a fundamental scientific principle. Geometry is not decoration, geometry is information. When geometry is altered, the interpretation changes. If the loop is removed, the representation loses path dependency, interaction structure, and energy meaning. The system is no longer described correctly. This is also another reason why applied topology in my pathophysiological research, a well-NE versus AI and structural interpretation difference between the two geometric outputs reflects a deeper distinction between NE and AI. Natural intelligence recognizes structural constraints inherent in the data. Geometry is treated as a primary carrier of scientific meaning. The resulting representation preserves the underlying mechanism. My brain NE distinguishes geometric movement directio through topology and the energy state and magnitude at a certain time instant through viscoplasticity. Artificial intelligence, in its current form, often interprets data through learned patterns. It tends to produce smooth, symmetric, or commonly observed shapes unless constrained otherwise. This characteristic can be observed through its LLM modeling on language polishing. However, the limitation is not due to its non-confrontational or polite linguistic style, but because present AI is fundamentally a pattern-based approximation system rather than a physics-based reasoning system. Without explicit guidance, it may generate representations that appear visually reasonable but do not preserve true structural relationships. This distinction does not imply absence of learning in AI. Rather, it indicates that learned knowledge is not automatically enforced by physical or structural constraints. In summary, NE equals constraint-driven, mechanism-aware, geometry-preserving, AI equals pattern-driven, approximation-based, geometry-losing. Extension to system-level comparison. The geometric example reflects a broader systems-level pattern. The human biomedical system, artificially the brain, operates with embedded, continuous, and enforced learning, regulatory mechanisms such as glucose control and blood pressure regulation function through dense feedback loops with high-frequency correction. Over millions of years of evolution, these mechanisms have been refined and integrated into the system structure. This produces a system with strong internal coordination and relative stability. In contrast, the geopolitical system evolves through discrete historical events. Major disruptions such as W1 and WW2 led to institutional responses, including the formation of the United Nations. Even now, the UN seems to be losing its power and original intention. These responses represent learning, but the learning is external, episodic, and not fully embedded within the system. Different actors may not follow the same rules, and enforcement is inconsistent. As a result, previously learned lessons may not translate into stable behavior. This leads to repeated cycles of tension and disruption, which have been reflected in the geopolitical system. Unified interpretation across domains. The observations from geometry reconstruction, intelligence comparison, and geopolitical system dynamics can be unified into a single principle. Systems differ not by whether they learn, but by how learning is integrated into thy structure. Systems with embedded, continuous, and enforced learning preserve structural relationships and maintain stability. Systems with external, discontinuous, and non-binding learning may lose structural coherence and exhibit recurrent instability. Based on this conclusion, that was why I practiced lifestyle management over medication taking for my metabolic disorders control and overall health improvement. Lifestyle management respects the loop of the body's circadian and metabolic rhythms, whereas medication often treats a single data point without considering the system's trajectory. In the geometric example, E preserves the loop structure and therefore preserves system meaning. A, without explicit constraint enforcement, may lose that structure. In biomedical systems, embedded feedback maintains stability. In geopolitical systems, the absence of embedded coordination leads to oscillatory behavior and repeated disruption. Conclusion: the comparison between E and AI through geometric reconstruction provides direct evidence of a broader systems principle. The essential distinction is whether learning becomes part of the system structure and continuously governs its behavior. Natural intelligence and the human-evolved biomedical system over million years represent structurally integrated learning, where geometry, mechanism, and behavior remain consistent. Artificial intelligence and geopolitical systems evolved only thousands years represent externally guided learning, where structural meaning may not always be preserved, leading to instability and repeated failure patterns. Human body is not a state-only machine, it is a history-dependent machine. In my use cases, AI fails to preserve path-dependent structure and repeatedly generates incorrect graphics. Even after multiple correction attempts, this is a major practical weakness. This framework offers a consistent way to interpret system behavior across domains, linking geometry, energy, learning, and stability into a unified perspective. In a world increasingly obsessed with big data, we often forget that data without structure is noise. Regarding topology applications in pathology and physiology, by applying topology, I am looking at the shape of the disease, not just the magnitude. This is a shift from quantitative medicine to structural medicine. Epilogue: at age 79, and at this stage of my 17th year in medical research, I have finally recognized a truth that was invisible to me for decades. My lifetime of academic and professional work in engineering and AI trained me to understand inorganic materials and structure systems whose properties are governed by constitutive laws and are generally more stable and predictable. By contrast, my past 17 years of self-study and research in biomedicine have immersed me in organic materials and structure systems that are alive, adaptive, self-modifying, and continuously reshaped by time, energy, hormones, emotions, and environment. These two categories of materials are not simply different in composition. They operate under entirely different logics of behavior. Inorganic materials respond to forces. Organic materials respond to forces and rewrite their own internal rules in the process. This shift from modeling passive matter to modeling living matter is not a change of domain but a change of worldview. It requires abandoning the assumption that systems are static and embracing the reality that biological systems are dynamic, path-dependent, and constantly evolving. Only now do I see that the bridge between these two worlds has defined my entire scientific journey. My engineering and AI background gave me the tools to understand structure, stress, strain, and failure. My biomedical research taught empathy living tissues and cells add layers of adaptation, memory, and drift that no inorganic system possesses. The transition from inorganic to organic materials is not merely a professional shift, it is a shift in the fundamental logic of how systems behave. And understanding that difference has shaped everything I have done. Recognizing this distinction allowed me to build a new framework for understanding chronic diseases as dynamic, evolving systems rather than static diagnostic categories, one grounded in energy, stress, strain, adaptation, plus both time-dependent and path-dependent material change. Disclaimer: I write this paper not for fame, but to share what I have learned so others can understand their health, prevent disease, and live longer, healthier lives. This content is provided for educational reference only and does not constitute medical advice. No doctor-patient relationship is created. You may share this summary freely, but it must not be altered, edited, or republished as your own. All intellectual property rights and copyright for this article and its related materials belong to Th. Author Gerald C. This content is provided for educational reference only and does not constitute medical advice. No doctor-patient relationship is created. You may share this summary freely, but it must not be altered, edited, or republished as your own. All intellectual property rights and copyright for this article and its related materials belong to the author, Gerald C.